Welcome. I'm Aurelien Portuese, Director of Antitrust and Innovation Policy at the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation. Today, the European and UK competition authorities opened investigations on Facebook. The agencies are concerned about whether Facebook ties its online classified ad service, Facebook Marketplace, where Facebook users can buy and sell goods from each other, with the social network Facebook. In other words, when Facebook innovated and created Facebook Marketplace to compete with market leaders such as Amazon, eBay, or Gumtree, as Facebook competed unfairly by leveraging its power from social network platform. This case, as many others, illustrate the intricate relationship between innovation, disrupting the status quo while using the firm's resources, with competition, which is not harming consumers or also foreclosing rivals. Are antitrust agencies well equipped to integrate innovation objectives as the central element of antitrust? Well, to be sure, innovation remains antitrust paradox. Everybody agrees that competition should foster innovation and that antitrust agencies should preserve innovation incentives. And yet, antitrust insufficiently considers the dynamic nature of innovation. So this conversation series, which is called Dynamic Antitrust, is essentially interested in the complex relationship between competition and innovation. Well, the economist José Schumpeter serves our intellectual mastermind to try to answer those questions. In an age of disruptive innovation, antitrust agencies may want to develop a dynamic approach to competition. But how can antitrust adopt a more dynamic approach to competition so that innovation really matters? To discuss this important topic, I'm delighted to have an exceptional line of speakers with me today. So first we have Ioana Marinescu, Professor of Economics at the University of Pennsylvania and Faculty Research Fellow at the National Bureau of Economic Research. If I believe Twitter, Ioana has recently got tenured, so congrats for such an achievement. Ioana has written extensively on labor markets and concentration, referred as monopsony problem. We also have David Thies. David is professor at the University of California, Berkeley. He's the founder and chairman of the Berkeley Research Group. He's the author of many books and articles. His latest book, titled Dynamic Capabilities, which is here, sums up decades of research during which David has advocated for a more dynamic approach to antitrust in line with Schumpeterian competition. And we have John Yoon. John is Associate Professor of Law and Director of Economic Education at the Global Antitrust Institute of George Mason University. John has been Acting Deputy Assistant Director in the Bureau of Economics Antitrust Division at the Federal Trade Commission. John has written extensively on the interaction between antitrust and innovation, and especially in the digital sector. So let me kick off the discussion with a very general question to each of you. What is a dynamic approach to competition, and why does it matter for antitrust analysis? Perhaps, David, do you want to start with that one?
Yes. Well, Peter, and the big idea came from him, where he pointed out that the primary driver of competition was innovation. The problem is that he didn't tell us how to operationalize that in terms of antitrust economics or antitrust policy. So the challenge, of course, is to think that through in a systematic way and say, well, if that's true, how should we enforce antitrust? How should we view competition? How should we come to understand competition? So that's where we are today, with a recognition that this is important, but he's largely been ignored. He's been ignored not because the idea is wrong, but because it's inconvenient. And by that, I mean it's inconvenient from an analytical process, particularly since even before Schumpeter, we had this idea that market structure drove performance of firms and industries rather than the other way around. So really, the enemy here is us economists who have been too reluctant to think through the implications, because it sort of messes up the tidy intellectual frameworks that have developed over the last 50 years.
Right. Yeah, that's the dynamic competition is very hard to operationalize, as you say, and it's sometimes more convenient. We have some antitrust tools that push for more static approach. Joanna, do you want to share with us your view on the dynamic?
Yeah. As a labor economist, I want to encourage us to think about the labor inputs and the fact that more and more in today's economy, they greatly contribute to innovation. In particular, you could think about tech workers, but also many other kinds of workforce, and that a lack of competition among employers and labor markets that are sclerotic, that don't allow for people to move from job to job, can constitute an important impediment to innovation, not only to the workers' own well-being and wage growth, but also more broadly to innovation in the economy. And we've seen, for example, in the case of antitrust, the cartel that the Silicon Valley companies had over labor, saying that we're not going to poach each other's employees. And that has been shown to reduce employees' wages, and likely, although I'm not aware of any study, has contributed to reducing innovation and the transmission of knowledge across companies in that area, just as one example. So I think it's worth thinking about that aspect of the issue.
Great. John, do you?
Thank you, Aurelien. And yeah, just to build on what David and Joanna said, dynamic antitrust is something everyone will say that they are for, to look at markets, looking into the future, and how we can maximize that innovation, because everyone recognizes, certainly through Expenditure, but work by Robert Solow on technology, and how really the wealth of nations and prosperity is based largely on innovation. And so anything that disrupts that process, even marginally, through labor or through disincentives to innovate, that can create real long-term effects on the growth and health of the economy that we won't see perhaps for a couple of years, but ultimately can lead to less prosperity. And so that's the challenge, right? Everyone says they're for it, but what do their policies really do in terms of changing that course of innovation?
Yeah, that's right. The difficulty is also to have a more forward-looking approach, and antitrust may inherently be more backward-looking, and it's the difficulty of that approach. But to what extent is these antitrust currently too static? Because some say that it refers to a static model or perfect competition. How can we bring some illustration of antitrust being too static and a need to perhaps alter that analysis? Joanna, do you want to have a word on the static approach?
I think one fundamental issue here is that over the longer run, innovators' identity changes. So at one time, a firm is a big innovator, and in that sense, it's gaining market share, let's say, because it's a good firm, right? In terms of its innovative prowess and the consumer benefits that it brings. However, we know that typically that doesn't last forever, and that to the extent that this firm is allowed to prevent other competitors from coming in, we'll probably lose innovation in the longer run. So I think the fundamental problem of antitrust is how to encourage innovation, but not necessarily punish the winners. And I think that balance is really hard to achieve. And that's really the key problem of how to hit the right balance between those two considerations. Like for another example from labor again is when you increase the minimum wage, for example, making labor more expensive. There's been a recent study for Germany, very interesting, where workers move to more productive firms. So in a way, that's great and probably increases overall productivity, But, if we let this situation go like this, it could in the long run mean that fewer new firms are started, which could, diminish innovation in the longer run. So I think really that's the fundamental tension, that these trade-offs are hard to measure and play out over decades. And that makes it only harder to think about what the optimal policy is.
That's very important aspect. David, do you want to see that? What is static antitrust? And
there's no doubt that static antitrust sort of flows from the focus on the short term. Whether it's merger analysis or whether it's price effects, antitrust tends to look short term. And of course, innovation does have short-term impact, but it frequently, requires a bit more than a 1 or 2 year period to really have impact. So indirectly, and once again, for convenience, for intellectual convenience, we take the short-term approach because, at least historically, it's been harder to take a long-term view. But guess what? Because we haven't focused on long-term analysis, the intellectual framework has not been built. So we've caused the problem to some extent. I think if for 50 years economists had a longer-term view and focused on innovation, we would have some at least rough and ready approaches at hand to analyze dynamic competition more confidently than we do now. If only 1% of antitrust economists had put their careers on this, we would be substantially out of the box. But 99%, no, actually more than that, 99.9% of economists have chosen to kind of follow the traditional sort of neoclassical approach. That's not to say there haven't been some case studies done and that there isn't been some empirical work that's informative, but it's all been brushed aside. And the mainstream has, kind of followed a pretty traditional static approach because behind it all, we want to use equilibrium analysis, and innovation is not about equilibrium; it's about disequilibrium. So there's almost no disequilibrium models, and there's limited work in that area because it's against the mainstream.
That's a very interesting intellectual call for action, because for decades, that's true that perhaps the lack of disequilibrium analysis has also created antitrust over-focus on static analysis. That's a very interesting point. So, for example, one of the core elements of antitrust is market definition, and market definition has been, repeatedly criticized as being too overly static. John, how can we improve market definition? Basically, the antitrust tools that we have, which are at the core of antitrust. So,
one way to improve it is to focus less on it, I guess. Market definition is very difficult, and certainly, and that relates to how we assess market power. And I think economists have done a good job, and I agree with David that it's been very slow, but there has been a movement away from static views, slowly, but I think surely, and that's reflected to some degree in the 2010 horizontal merger guidelines and the increased focus on competitive effects relative to structural definitions of markets, and from that inferring market power. Market power is really based off of substitution and the availability of substitution, whether in the short term, certainly dynamically in the long term. And I just think we're better served if we do start improving our economic tools, not on terms of critical loss and defining markets, but on assessing dynamic competition over time. And if we do that, then I think naturally we will focus away from market definition per se, because that's inherently static. I guess you can, for potential competition cases and nascent competition cases, expand the market and suggest that it's something larger, and that's fair, but you're getting into greater uncertainty. And so in some ways, I love that example Joanna said about minimum wage, where there's this tension between the short run and long run implications. And in a lot of ways, that's what agencies face. There's this tension of short run predictions, which are inherently easier to make and with less variance and with less uncertainty, with this longer term effect, which then could get very speculative. And so in a way, I don't know an answer to that. And I think that's where David's call to action was really important. We need better tools to make that balance, and I'm not sure we're there.
Yeah, that's very very good point. On market definition, we already see that there's less and less reliance on market definition because it's overly static. We have some cases where the agency just say that they're not doing market definition because it was not useful or it was just too difficult. So we already kind of starting to see a move of analyzing more competitive constraint rather than pure product market or geographic market. One essential element, and I think Joanna, you referred to that, like the entry in the market, the potential entry in the market, and I think that's core to the dynamic approach. So one element of new entrants in markets is to analyze potential competition, like potential entrants. And this is very important because it puts a lot of competitive constraints on the incumbents. How can we help incentivize entry or lower the barriers to entry in antitrust analysis, and why does it matter to lower these entry barriers?
Well, sorry, who did you direct that question?
Go ahead, David.
Whatever order.
Well, let's focus on potential competition for a while, because I think that's key. The reality is that most economists sort of throw their hands up in the air around potential competition because we really don't have very good tools for assessing it. And once again, the reason for that, in my view, is that we have not focused on capabilities. I've been writing now for 25 years or so on what I call dynamic capabilities, which are, key drivers of dynamic competition. But if we had a reasonable theory of potential competition, or a more robust theory, should I say, we'd be a lot further ahead. But, there's very few economists that have spent any time really digging hard into the concept of potential competition and analyzing the role of capabilities and the role of managers. It's really quite remarkable that the economics field is only now just starting to understand that management matters. The fact that you can get a paper published in the leading the leading economic journals with the title "Management Matters," which has happened in the last 5 years, speaks not to the fact that management matters. It speaks to the fact that economists haven't appreciated the fact that management matters, because nobody at a business school would believe for a moment that management doesn't matter. And business schools have been around for 100 years, and economics departments themselves have been in business schools. But once again, putting the manager into the equation messes up the story. It brings complexity, and we'd far sooner have simple models than robust models, so it seems, by the behavior of our profession. So I think the beginning of a robust dynamic competition framework is or requires digging in deep to understand potential competition way better than we do today. And that's where there's a lot of missed opportunity, because I'm quite certain if many of the smart people in the field had started on this 35, 40 years ago, we would have a better understanding. But at the same time, we're also going to have to recognize the role of uncertainty. And, once again, uncertainty is not the friend of economists, because it messes up the models. So that's the direction of travel I think we need to get to a dynamic competition framework.
That's very interesting, because going to the management or manager scale is precisely what Schumpeter referred as the entrepreneur, and looking at within the firm, that's the difficulty of antitrust enforcers. Joanna, I'm sorry, on potential competition. Yeah.
So, back to the issue of market definition, I'd like to make it concrete here and speak about the impact of mergers on workers and anti-competitive impacts of mergers on workers, which is a topic I've written on with Herb Hovenkamp. So, when you look at a potential merger, it's important to have at least a presumptive market definition for practical purposes. That doesn't mean you can't discuss it further based on additional data. But I think, if we're going to be able to screen efficiently for potentially problematic mergers, it's helpful to have at least a presumptive market definition. In the case of labor market, I propose to have occupation by commuting zones, so something like accountants and auditors in Philadelphia area would be a market, for example, in this case. And then the question is, well, what has been the effect of mergers on workers in this example, and in particular their wages? And what the research shows is that a merger that greatly increases labor market concentration. So here people might be familiar with product market concentration that measures the concentration of sales. Labor market concentration measures the concentration of either employment or hiring, so who are the big firms in this market. Well, when a merger greatly increases labor market concentration, it reduces wages. And so this is something that has had an adverse impact on workers. And, you can look over 5 years and, it's still there. So while you could think that in the longer run, there might be other entrants, I think it's quite important to not just wave our hands and say, there is potential entry. And of course there is, but the question is this enough to negate, the adverse effects on competition? I just took the example of labor, but it would be a similar case for the product market. I'm just illustrating this in this particular case. So I think really the key thing is to, have a balanced approach where we consider potential harms and whether this potential entry might mitigate the harms. And I think, it's not clear that it does. And so the question is, well, do mergers even really benefit innovation? Basically, part of it is a question of the burden of proof, or like, how should we think about it on average? And then we can examine each particular case. Do we really think that mergers facilitate innovation on average? That I think that's an important question to consider, and I'd love to hear what my co-panelists think about that.
That's a great point, and a very good transition to the next question I would like to discuss is about because we're talking about innovation and competition, and one way of looking at competition, one very easy metric is the research and development expenditures, right? We have some companies that spend a lot of money on research and development. And just to refer to the point that you just made, Joanna, in terms of merger, there's this growing concern about how and should we be concerned, and should we integrate research and development expenditures pre-merger as opposed to a post-merger? And should these concerns, like whether there's a decrease or increase on research and development expenditures, is this a way of looking at mergers and a way of assessing the potential or beneficial or negative effect of mergers? David, do you want to have a word on this element of R&D expenditures?
Yes, I wouldn't put too much weight on R&D expenditures. Yes, it's often the case that innovative firms spend a fair amount on R&D, but it's also the case that it's not the absolute level of expenditure, but it's the astuteness with which those dollars are reallocated or allocated that matters. I mean, I remember that Apple had 2% of revenues on R&D at the time it came up with the iPhone, and Nokia had 8%. But which company was the most innovative? I think it was Apple, not Nokia. So yes, I think being aware of the fact that you're in an industry where there's rich technological opportunity matters for the assessment of competition. And often the fact that people are spending a lot on R&D is indicative of the fact there's rich technological opportunity. But I don't think there is a simple way to focus just on R&D expenditures as a proxy. It's a starting point for merger analysis and for understanding an industry, but it isn't the finishing point.
Great. John, do you want to have a word on R&D and mergers in specifically, but also more generally for antitrust?
I would agree with David in that an R&D is a means to an end. It's a means to innovation, and it's an input into a larger production process, along with other inputs that firms use to innovate and create dynamic products and certainly profitability. And so to the extent that any types of conduct, whether it's an antitrust or regulatory, can influence or affect R&D, and in turn, how does that affect innovation? Of course, we care. But there doesn't seem to me a sort of an ex ante reason for us to overtly focus on the level of innovation or changes per se, but only to the extent that that would ultimately impact innovation and some competitive result. And so, it's the same thing as data. Data is a larger input to the final product, and to the extent that there's certain conduct that affects data in a way that's anti-competitive, that certainly can be a concern. But in of itself, it doesn't seem to me sort of an ex-ante reason for us to be concerned per se as a policy. That being said, I did want to jump on and with just a little bit of time talk about potential competition. And the only sort of point I wanted to add was there's a big difference that economists really recognize that I think could be used more broadly, is the difference between ex-ante sort of decision-making and ex-post results. And with potential competition, I think there's a danger where we're focused on ex-post results and then suggesting ex-ante there was a sort of a problem with antitrust or a problem with the decision-making. Sometimes there's an error rate, and that error rate is simply a byproduct of, David mentioned, of uncertainty, unknowable things. So if we get too caught up on the accuracy of the prediction per se, rather than how the decisions were made, given the level of information at the time, you can make a great decision at the time and it could turn out wrong. And I just, there's a larger discussion with that, but I think that's something we should always keep in mind when we talk about potential competition, nascent competition in these areas. There's inherent uncertainty. And so this desire to eliminate all uncertainty and all error actually can create sort of these absolute rules that will ultimately hurt dynamic innovation.
Great, a great point. Ioana, do you want to have a word on R&D as a proxy for antitrust analysis?
Right. So just as has been said before, just because a company invests in R&D more doesn't necessarily mean that it's more innovative, but it's certainly an indicator that R&D matters. And, the tricky part with that is that, my co-author, Philippe Aguillon, who's an innovation economist, he has this really neat paper about the inverted view of competition, where, if there's not enough competition, it looks like firms don't innovate a lot because basically they don't have fire behind them to push them to innovate. But if there's too much competition, that can also hamper innovation, presumably because perhaps profitability margins are too low and they're just their nose focusing on the next day. And at somewhere in between, there's more competition. But if that's the case, it makes the job really difficult for the antitrust authorities, because trying to hit that sweet spot is hard and maybe not desirable for policymakers to go there. So I think it's a fairly difficult process to think about what is the right procedure to have in place. And of course, I agree with you, John, that it has to be the right procedure. Ex ante, you're never gonna know everything, and some decisions might turn out to be bad. However, I still think that using data to analyze what has happened with past mergers or past conduct we know of, to look at the consequences, especially over the longer run, because that's where potential consequences for innovations materialized. That's very, very important to kind of fix ideas about what could go wrong, what could go right with those kinds of conducts that we're looking at under antitrust analysis. So I do think that, just because there's uncertainty and it's complicated doesn't mean that we have to wave our hands and say like data can't inform. We have to find intelligent ways, that our job as economists, to actually inform the debate by looking at the past history using data and seeing, what has happened in the aftermath of XYZ conduct that we've seen in the past. And again, not just in the immediate aftermath, but 10 years down the line, what happened there, which, it's ambitious, it can be difficult, but it's definitely worth doing. And that's what we need to better understand the issues at hand.
That's a great point, and I'm very pleased that you refer to Philippe Aghion, because he's part of this Schumpeterian tradition of trying to explain the relationship between competition and innovation, and that's right. I mean, too much competition may not lead to innovation. That's the neck and neck competition, but at the same time, too little might not be optimal. So there's this optimal level of competition where, just to relate to David's work, you need sufficient capabilities and sufficient appropriability of resources to invest and to look at the longer term. So it's very hard for antitrust enforcement, and we don't have clear-cut, easy answers, I would assume. But I think innovation, at the end of the day, is disruption, right? Is disruptive in its very nature, and it harms the incumbents or the traditional laggards firms. And the question is, antitrust is concerned about harms. I mean, consumer harm or any harm in society. So how can we tell apart the harm which is inherent to disruptive innovation, because disruptors harm these laggards companies, and harm that is anti-competitive? David, what do you want to say on that?
Well, this brings me to my other big point, which is that in thinking about economic rents, we should distinguish between Schumpeterian rents, Ricardian rents, and I'll call them pure monopoly rents. But we don't. Schumpeterian rents, we should be very happy to see them, because they're the returns to innovation. Ricardian rents, which are the returns to a scarce input, we should be happy from a public policy point of view to see those, because that then leads to competition to erode those bottlenecks. But rents that result from the suppression of competition, the naked suppression of competition, is what pure monopoly rents are. But guess what? In the whole field, nobody makes these distinctions. And it's really quite remarkable. The public doesn't. Profits are all thrown in one big pot. If there's high profits, people naively assume there's monopoly power and that it's antisocial. In fact, 2/3 of it's just the opposite. And we haven't yet got the discriminating frameworks worked out, but it's not because it's impossible to do so. It's because we're barely started on the analysis. If we had made these points research agendas 20 years ago, we would be looking at big tech in a very different way. Yes, big tech is profitable, but it's not because, in my view, it's not because of restraints on competition. It's because of the very successful innovation-driven competition that most of the rents are Schumpeterian and Ricardian. There may be some that are not, but the whole debate about this is almost is naive, because we haven't really got a robust framework to distinguish between these different types of economic rents. But economic welfare would tell you should look at them very differently.
Yeah, that's a very interesting point. I get from the naked monopoly rents that you just referred to. I may perhaps make a link with Joanna's work on these naked agreements, on non-punching agreements or non-compete clause, right? So do you want to have a say on that, Joanna, perhaps?
Actually, this is a great segue into some of the audience questions. Somebody was asking about intellectual property, and so I think it's an interesting way to link that to the issue of competition for workers. So first of all, let me say that anti-poaching agreements are per se illegal. So you can't go and say to your competitor company, don't hire my workers, don't even think of it, and we agree mutually not to hire each other's workers. That is illegal. illegal. But what is allowed is this non-competition agreements, which have similar effects, but now it's not an agreement between competitors, it's an agreement between the company and its employee, that the employee will not go and work for competitors after it leaves the company. And so that, I think, is quite problematic because it's a very blunt tool. It says, you know, you're not going to work for any of the competitors. Many of the restrictions are very severe in terms of the, for example, the geographic scope or the type of companies that they're allowed to work for. They often applies to it often applies to employees that don't actually have trade secrets. And for those who do have trade secrets, it gets back to this idea of intellectual property. I would ask, are there other tools we have to legitimately protect intellectual property instead of using this blunt and, I'd argue, anti-competitive instrument of saying you cannot go work for any of the competitors after you leave this company? So I think, you know, in terms of thinking about competition in this specific aspect, and again, it is linked to innovation because, you know, as people circulate, they can help circulate good ideas. You know, it's understandable that companies want to protect their IP, but there's instruments that are made for that, and using the blunt, you shall not work for any competitor, you know, can really diminish competition for workers and diminish innovation, as these workers are not allowed to allocate themselves, you know, where their talent could be best put at use. So I think we need to rethink the use of non-competition agreements and whether they can be usefully replaced by more, you know, pinpoint tools when there is a need to protect certain specific IP or trade secrets, and get, again, instead of having this blunt tool that diminishes competition for workers.
That's very interesting point of the relationship between labor law, IP law, and competition law. I believe that some states have prohibited non-compete clause, right? It's allowed in some states and prohibited.
Well, it's a little more complicated. Let me jump in here because I'm not sure that we're all going to sing from the same songbook on this one. I do believe, first of all, I think we can all agree that agreements to not poach that are done collaboratively are not just illegal, but from an economic point of view, certainly would not support that at all. And indeed, the companies that engage in that behavior did get the wrong end of the stick from an antitrust point of view. But I do believe there is a case for restrictive employment contracts, and it's because of the appropriability issue. Profiting from innovation is necessary to continue to innovate, and there are imitators out there, and I believe there is a case for restrictive employment contracts. Now, the only way in most states you can, at least in the United States, you can enforce non-compete clauses if you pay somebody to enter into a non-compete. If there's no consideration for it, typically you can't enforce a non-compete. So companies, if they're investing heavily in employees, they do need to have some confidence that those employees are not going to walk across the street with the ideas. So you can't naively say, I don't believe, that anything that restricts the diffusion of ideas is bad. Sometimes it's necessary so that the innovator or the pioneer, whoever it is paying for that research, can get a return for it. Otherwise, they won't invest in it. So I think we have to be very careful in thinking about employment restrictions. Certainly, restrictions that are overly broad, I would agree with you, are not positive for competition. But there has to be enforceable non-competes in circumstances where companies are making significant investments in individuals, and where there is otherwise no other, where there is very few other tools that are available to appropriate returns from innovation.
Yeah, so that's a very interesting discussion, and I think there's also, as Joanna said, IP laws that can be involved on that. John, perhaps on a very different topic, we're talking about dynamic competition in general, and of course, antitrust is very hated those days. There's a lot of news about it, and there's Congress and parliaments all around the world getting involved in reforming antitrust. What do you think about these regulatory reforms that are ongoing, and the tone of the discussion those days about antitrust reforms? Is it going toward a more dynamic approach to competition? Is it going on the right direction or not on the right direction?
So, thank you for the question. So my sort of view is, there's nothing wrong with regulation per se, but it's speaking a blunt instrument, it's a very strong instrument to change a market outcome that we think is failing. And so the question to me is, I think the burden should be on those who are advancing it, that the markets have failed in a systematic way, and that we need to move antitrust away from the agencies and courts into the legislation and legislator. I'm not convinced that evidence is there, and part of it is this ex ante ex post discussion that I mentioned earlier. But the point is that I often hear that these cases are very difficult. It's long. Sometimes agencies lose, and it seems like these firms are getting away with anti-competitive conduct. But my response to that is that there's nothing wrong with difficult cases. Difficult cases make, I think, really important precedents for us and guidance for firms, and it's an adversarial process for sure. But that difficulty is because a lot of markets are complicated. And, at the heart, I think antitrust isn't about enforcing Sherman, Clayton, or FTC Act. It's about understanding markets and why firms are engaging in conduct. There could be very illegitimate reasons to engage in conduct, and I think the agency should be very hard on firms when that happens. No poaching, per se price fixing, certainly certain types of exclusive deals. There's no justification for those. But there's other things that we are anti-steering, for example, American Express, Ohio versus American Express. There's going to be strong opinions. Good economists on both sides have very good arguments. But that's, I think, the benefit of the adversarial system is that you get those types of ideas out. I think it will spur, hopefully, research into better understanding. And maybe there's an error rate. Maybe the agencies and the courts did get it wrong. But the goal is not to fix everything immediately, but to see if we're moving at least structurally or directionally in the right way. The problem with regulation is if you get it wrong initially, I don't think there's a fix that's really easy to unravel. Maybe we'll get it right initially, and so that's a possibility. So it's not to say it's off the table. It's just, well, is there a problem? Have we met that burden that there's a problem? And is that regulation really going to fix the problem and not make things worse?
Very interesting. Joanna, what do you think about those regulatory reforms on competition and antitrust?
So I think it's always a delicate balance, and I think we need good frameworks. So that include enough flexibility. So the again, talking about blunt instruments, when regulation, I say quantity regulation, stuff like that, we kind of want to avoid those sorts of things. But it is useful to have guidelines so that enforcement can happen. Because essentially, when we make things too floaty, unclear, things happen and we don't have a grip to try to intervene in what's going on. So I think that's really the balance. And that's why, for example, again, in my area that I've been working on issues around competition for labor, there aren't many cases. And, antitrust law completely applies to these cases, and it's already there, and you shouldn't need anything extra in terms of legislation, frankly. But maybe you do just because of legal uncertainty, just to clarify that it does apply, because right now the federal antitrust authorities are a little bit hampered by the absence of precedent and the fact that it can be hard to win these cases at all, even though they are under the purview of antitrust. So that's why, and this is just one particular example of how regulation can be seen as a framework. Let's try to have a good framework within which this adversarial system can take place. and not necessarily, prescribe, very specific quantitative outcomes. So I think it's important to think in this way rather than, again, having a very blunt regulation that, of course, could easily go wrong.
Thank you. Very interesting. David, I think you wrote about the Digital Markets Act and these regulation in Europe. But so what is your say on these proposed regulation?
I'm kind of where John is. I mean, first of all, if I had confidence that the regulators understood dynamic competition and would have a good chance of getting things right, that would be one thing. But I have no confidence of that. I do have more confidence in the courts, because, judges and juries actually do listen to evidence. And in some sense, it's likely to be more empirical than the regulatory process. And yes, we shouldn't have a standard of perfection. I think we should try and accelerate the process. But courts, I think, will listen to dynamic competition arguments because they really got a lot more common sense than a lot of the other arguments that are put out there. So I think there's a lot of good case law that can be used to favor dynamic competition. If we could just accelerate the process, that would be way better than regulation, because as John suggested, once that gets going, it takes a life of its own. And it tends to be wooden. It's not flexible. The case law is more flexible than regulation typically.
That's very interesting. The judicial process as part of the evolutionary process, which is itself part of the dynamic view to competition. That's a very interesting viewpoint, and I think we're moving away from that perspective those days. So I think we're out of time. I think I can take one or two questions. There's one question about why is antitrust regarded as the only tool to regulate digital platforms? That's part of the. What about market failures and are digital markets functioning markets, or are they completely failing? This refers to what you just said, John. Do we have evidence that they're failing, and should we regulate them differently? John, do you?
So I'll just keep it short. This is a tough question. Are these markets failing in what way? Could they be better? Certainly, we can imagine markets working better than they are in these digital sectors, but we can imagine them working a lot worse as well. And to me, these markets have a great deal of innovation. I think we would all accept that. The question is are they engaging in conduct that's hampering that innovative process that we could address through antitrust laws? And if we can't, do we need a regulatory solution on top of that? My final thought on that is one concern. What I like is the agencies are bringing cases. So they're bringing the cases. This will allow the adversarial system to work and see where these cases end up. And I think that's important, and it's important to the public. It's important to the enforcement of antitrust laws. But what I worry about is what happens. What if the agencies lose? Let's just say that for a moment. It's kind of a situation where I'm not sure the digital firms are in a good place at that point, because then it's QED that they can't handle these firms. It's antitrust is a failure. We need regulation to come in. So to me, that seems. And what if obviously the agencies win? Then they can come down with very strong remedies, and rightly so. If they win the cases on the merits, then I think there should be remedies. So it seems as if there's no win situation if we accept the premise that these markets are broken. In some ways, I would just like the adversarial system to work. And if it comes out that the agencies lose, then to me, maybe there's a re-examination and say maybe the conduct wasn't a violation of antitrust laws and it's not hampering innovation. But I worry it's actually going to be the opposite.
That's very interesting because it refers to possibility to have counterfactuals, right? To speculate about the something different than reality. Joanna, do you want to have a stake on that? On what about digital market? Are these different digital markets than labor market or like product market in general, or should they be treated exactly the same way as?
They are special. Some aspects of them are utility-like, and so we need to, think about and innovate based on. They are different from utilities, but there are aspects, for example, like the network or the data. By the way, the data is very important. The way we think about data, and so, for example, issues around data portability could be quite important in terms of allowing consumers to take the data where they want and spurring competition across different software companies, for example, that are able to use that data. So there are certainly specific ways in which these digital platforms are different from your ordinary business, and then we have to think about what could be good approaches to foster competition, given the specific characteristics of those platforms. So we all know that with search, for example, it's very convenient to have one place to go, and So anyway, so you all know how that goes, and it's very difficult to get it right. But I think there's hope in finding a good way to go about it by thinking more and looking at the evidence and drawing from the past successes and failures of regulation of utilities, transportation companies, anything that is kind of infrastructure like in this way. I think it's useful to think about the lessons that we can draw from those.
Right. David, the final word for you, perhaps. What about these digital markets? Should it be treated differently? Yeah.
I believe there's very powerful competition. It's broad spectrum competition, and it's not the standard network effect story. It's about big data and the management and orchestration of big data. We're only just beginning to really understand these situations. And I think once again we're sort of zeroed in on network effects and platforms in way too narrow a way. I think we need a more a broader systems approach to understanding what's going on. But coming back to what John said, look, I think that antitrust can sort of deal with this, or at least we're going to learn a lot more through these antitrust cases before jumping onto the regulatory bandwidth. And what's striking to me is that it's not the consumers that are complaining most of the time. It's almost always other companies. It's almost always competitors. And certainly in Europe, the DMA is motivated not by a whole raft of consumer complaints. It's a bunch of companies that can't compete. And then this is where I come back to Jona's point about labor markets. No wonder in Europe you can't compete, because the labor market is so wooden. And we do need to have flexible entrepreneurial labor markets to drive new competition. So I think there's lots of things that need to be improved upon, and it's premature to jump to sort of utility type regulation. Maybe this can be looked at further down the road. At the same time, I do think, while I'm complaining about competition policy as being short-term, I think a lot of the CEOs of big tech are somewhat short-term too. And they have to be aware of the broader social consequences of a lot of their behaviors and actions. And if they want to keep the regulators off their back, they've got to be more careful about a lot of the forms of business conduct that they engage in. So I don't want to whitewash big tech at all. I think there are genuine issues. Many of them are not competition policy issues, however.
Yeah. Very, very interesting, and it's great to close the discussion on the reference to the entrepreneur, because that's a key aspect of the dynamic view to competition. So thank you all for this great conversation. At least we see that there's a need for dynamic view of competition. It's hard to have it, hard to operationalize it, but I think that's the great challenge for antitrust authorities to get closer to that view and address the challenge of today in a more dynamic, evolutionary way, because that's the market realities, and that's the business realities that companies live in. So thank you all for this great discussion. It was very interesting with different viewpoints, with different arguments, and I'm sure our viewers will have enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you.